The valley was covered in silver mist, and the ground was wet with morning dew, and the air was cold and heavy with silence, and the cubs moved carefully through the tall grass, with ears high and tails low, and their paws made no sound as they walked, and they looked around with wide eyes, for they knew this place was forbidden, and yet their paws kept moving deeper into the valley, where the shadows were longer, and the mist was thicker, and every sound echoed, like a warning that they were not welcome here. The cubs had always heard stories about the valley from the elders who whispered around the fires, and told them of creatures that walked on two legs, and carried fire in their hands, and built things that no beast could understand, and the elders warned that those who entered the valley never returned, and yet the cubs were curious, and their young hearts pushed them forward even though fear scratched at their bones. They moved together in a small pack, pressing close, and whispering to one another in short sounds, their fur brushing against each other, as if touch could keep the fear away, and the valley felt alive, as if eyes were on them from the trees, and from the rocks, and from the mist itself, and every breath felt heavy and strange. Then they smelled something new, something they had never smelled before. It was sharp and smoky, and carried warmth, like burning wood, yet there was no lightning strike, no fallen tree, no wild fire racing through the grass. Instead it was steady and controlled, and their noses twitched as they followed the scent drawn forward, without knowing why. They pushed through the mist, and then they saw it, a glow unlike the glow of stars or moon, a glow that flickered and danced, and gave both warmth and danger, and around it sat a figure, one unlike any creature they had seen before. The figure was tall, though it sat low near the fire, and it had no fur except on its head and face, and its body was wrapped in strange coverings like second skin made of cloth and hide and metal, and in its hands it held a long stick that glowed at one end with living flame, and its eyes reflected the light of the fire, like two deep pools that could swallow anything that stared too long. The cubs froze, their bodies shaking with instinct telling them to flee, to run back to the safety of their den, to cry out for the elders to save them. But their paws did not move, their tails did not turn. Instead, they stood caught in a silence that was not fear alone, but something else, something deeper. The figure raised its head, and its gaze met theirs, and in that moment the cubs felt the weight of something they could not name. The eyes of the figure were not the eyes of prey, and not the eyes of predator. They were eyes filled with thought and memory, and something like kindness, but also something like danger, as if the figure could crush them with a single move, but chose not to. The cubs stepped closer without meaning to their paws, carrying them into the circle of the firelight, and the warmth touched their fur, and made them shiver, not with fear, but with wonder. The figure did not chase them away. The figure only watched and tilted its head, as if curious, just as they were. One cub sat down, the others followed, pressing their small bodies against the cool earth beside the fire, and the figure did nothing to stop them. It simply looked at them with those strange human eyes, and slowly placed a piece of wood into the fire. The flames rose and cracked, and sent sparks into the mist, and the cubs jumped, but they did not run. Instead, they stared with wide glowing eyes as the fire burned brighter. The valley was silent except for the sound of the fire, and the soft breath of the cubs, and the steady calm breathing of the human. And though the cubs did not understand why they felt safe near him, safer than they had ever felt in the wild, safer than even inside the den of their people, they should have run back into the night. They should have turned away from the fire and from the figure who carried it, but they did not. Instead, they stayed, and their hearts beat faster, not from terror, but from a strange pull, as if this moment was meant to be, as if the human had been waiting for them. And so the cubs sat beside the human while the fire crackled, and the mist closed in around them, and the night grew darker, and the valley watched in silence, holding its breath, for something had begun, and nothing would ever be the same again. The den was carved deep inside the red stone cliffs, and its walls held the warmth of many generations who had lived and died under the watch of the ancestors, and the cubs had always felt safe there, surrounded by the voices of the clan, and the constant fire that burned at the center, and filled the air with smoke that clung to their fur like a protective veil. But that night the air was heavy and uneasy, because the cubs had not returned with the others. When the hunting party came home, and the elders whispered to each other, with eyes narrowed and tails twitching with worry, the oldest of the elders, a great sheep beast with scars across her muzzle, lifted her head and spoke in a voice that made even the strongest warriors bow low. She said, "The cubs have wandered where they should not, and they are in the valley of the forbidden, and she did not need to say more, because every creature in the den knew the valley was a place of shadows and secrets and danger beyond understanding. The young hunters glanced at one another, their ears flat, and their claws scraping the stone floor. They wanted to run out and find the cubs, but the elder shook her head and reminded them that the valley was not for them, and that those who walked into the mist did not come back whole. If they came back at all, the stories had been told for generations, and though some called them old tales, meant only to frighten the young, there were those who had seen enough to believe. They spoke of a wanderer who walked on two legs and carried fire in his hands, and his gaze could burn through the strongest heart, and his voice could make the wild beasts obey or fall silent. They said he was not of their world, that he had fallen from the sky long ago, when the stars cracked and the air filled with thunder and light, and when he came he brought both ruin and salvation, depending on who told the tale. Some elders claimed the human was a spirit of punishment who arrived when clans grew proud and forgot their place in the balance of life. Others claimed he was a teacher who offered fire and knowledge, but only to those brave enough to face him. Most, however, warned the young that he was only death, and that the fire he held was not for their kind. The cubs had heard these stories many times whispered at night, when the wind howled through the rocks, and now they were the ones who had gone too close, and the elders knew that the valley would test them and perhaps break them. One warrior stood and growled that they should go now, that they should take spears and torches and drag the cubs back before it was too late. But the elder with the scars shook her head again and said, if they sit with the human, then it is already too late. They are changed and cannot be unmade. The den fell into silence, heavy like stone pressing on every chest. The younger mothers pulled their little ones closer, wrapping tails around them and whispering that they must never leave the safe walls. The fathers stared at the flames and wondered if they would have the strength to fight should the human come walking out of the valley again, for in the oldest memory of the clan it was said that he had come before, and when he did the world shifted. The cubs did not know of this fear that swirled inside the den. They sat by the fire with the human, their small hearts pounding with the rhythm of the flames, the air around them warm and glowing, while the mist of the valley curled and twisted like spirits watching from the edges. The human had given them pieces of cooked meat, blackened on the outside and soft inside, and though they had never eaten such a thing before, their hunger overcame their hesitation, and they tasted it, and their eyes widened at the flavor that filled their mouths with heat and strength. They looked at each other as if sharing a secret. They could not yet speak. The fire made their fur glow in shades of red and gold, and they felt strong in a way they never had under the cold eyes of their own kind. The human hummed a low tune, strange and rolling like water against stone, and the cubs felt calm, even though every instinct told them they should have been trembling with fear. Far away the elders argued still. One said the cubs must be left to their fate, for no one who sat with the human could return unchanged. Another said if they return, they must be cast out, for the curse of the fire would follow them back into the den. Yet another said maybe the time had come to face the old warnings and see if the human was still the same as the stories told. But the scarred elder lifted her head and silenced them again with a single word: patience, for the valley chooses who it keeps and who it returns, and until then they must wait and watch. The night dragged on heavy with the weight of silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire inside the den and the howls of the far-away beasts. The clan did not sleep. They sat restless, thinking of the cubs lost in the mist, thinking of the human who should not be real and yet was said to be waiting in the valley with his fire and his eyes. The cubs pressed closer to the flames, their small bodies warmed, their fear fading into wonder. They did not know that their choice to sit by the human would ripple through the clan, through the valley, and perhaps through the stars themselves. They only knew that the fire was beautiful, and that the figure beside it, though strange, did not harm them, and in their hearts a seed of trust was planted, one that could not be undone. When dawn began to touch the mist with silver light, the cubs lay curled beside the human, their breathing soft, their dreams filled with sparks and voices they could not yet understand, and the human watched them, his eyes calm and steady, as if he had been waiting through endless nights for such company, his hand resting on the earth close to them, but never touching, as if he knew the weight of that gesture would be too great. In the den the elders felt the change in the air. Though they could not see the valley, they knew something had shifted. The scarred elder whispered that the world was turning again, and the others bowed their heads in fear. The cubs slept unaware that their choice had already broken the old rules, and that soon the valley, the clan, and the human would all be bound together by a story that none of them could escape. The sun rose weak through the heavy mist, and the light painted the valley in shades of gray and pale silver, and the cubs blinked awake, with tired eyes, their fur still carrying the scent of smoke and warmth from the fire they had sat beside all night, and when their eyes adjusted they saw the human, still there unmoving except for his slow steady breathing, and his hands that worked carefully with stone and metal pieces that glimmered in the early light. The cubs crouched low at first, unsure of what he was doing, their ears flicking and tails twitching with curiosity, for they had never seen tools shaped with such purpose. The human took 2 stones, one flat and one sharp, and struck them together with measured rhythm, and sparks leapt from the touch, and danced before falling away into the soil. The cubs gasped at the sight, their young minds trying to understand what kind of power could be drawn from such simple things. The human gathered small sticks and dried grass and pressed them into a pile, then struck again until a tiny flame was born, and the cubs shivered at the miracle before them, for never had they seen fire made from nothing but hands and stone in their world. Fire came only when lightning cracked the sky, or when trees fell during storms, but here it was born like a living creature, called into being by this strange figure who sat so calm, so steady. One cub crept closer, nose twitching, whiskers trembling as the fire grew, and the warmth touched its fur. The others followed, pressing close to each other for courage, their wide eyes fixed on the growing flame. The human fed it with pieces of wood stacked in careful order, and soon the fire grew tall, sending sparks into the air and filling the valley with smoke that curled like pale ribbons in the wind. The cubs could not look away. The fire was danger, and yet it was also safety. It was wild but under control, and the human seemed to command it with ease. He placed something on a flat piece of metal over the flame, and soon a smell drifted into the air, rich and strange, and so unlike raw flesh that their stomachs twisted with hunger. The human looked at them, then his eyes soft, his face lined with something they did not understand. He broke pieces from what he had cooked and set them down on a stone before the cubs. The smell was too much for them to resist. Their paws trembled, but they reached forward and tasted the food. It was hot and strange, yet it filled them with strength in a way they had never felt before. Each bite made their hearts beat faster, their eyes brightened, their spirits feel lifted. The cubs looked at each other, their expressions wide with shock and delight. This was not the harsh struggle of chewing raw bone and sinew. This was something new, something almost gentle. The human watched them eat with no anger, no threat, only calm curiosity, and when they finished he added more wood to the fire and sat quietly humming a low sound that echoed like deep water rolling over stones. The sound lulled the cubs into calm, though they could not understand the meaning of the song. They felt it in their bones, a rhythm steady and certain, as if the valley itself listened and breathed along with it. The mist swirled around them like soft spirits, and the fire cracked with each note, as if it too was part of the song. Hours passed. The cubs explored the circle of the firelight. They sniffed at the human's strange belongings, pieces of metal shaped with care, cords of hide bound together, and tools whose purposes they could not imagine. They pawed at them, gently pulling back whenever the human moved, though he never raised his hand against them, never bared teeth or claws. He only let them look, as though he wished them to learn. One cub touched a tool shaped like a curved claw attached to a handle of wood, and the human took it back, gently showing the cub how it could cut through bark. With ease the cubs yelped in surprise and wonder. The tool was sharper than the teeth of their strongest hunters, and the human wielded it with skill, but never in anger. The day grew brighter, yet the mist clung stubbornly to the valley. The cubs forgot fear, they forgot the warnings of their elders. They only saw the fire, the food, and the calm figure who shared them without demand. It was as if the world outside the circle of fire no longer mattered, as if they had stepped into another life altogether. When the sun began to fall again, shadows stretched long and dark across the valley, and the cubs felt the old fear stir. Once more the night belonged to predators, and even young hearts remembered the danger that stalked in darkness. They looked to the human, wondering if he would leave them, or if he would walk away into the mist. But he did not rise. He sat and added more wood to the fire until it burned brighter than before. The cubs heard growls in the distance, deep and hungry, sounds that made their fur bristle, their ears strained, their tails curled close. And yet the human showed no fear. He lifted a long stick wrapped at one end with fire and held it before him, his body steady, his eyes calm. The cubs pressed close together, their hearts racing, but the human only waited. From the shadows, eyes appeared glowing with hunger. Massive shapes moved slowly, circling, drawn by the scent of meat, and the sound of small hearts beating fast. The cubs whimpered, but the human did not flinch. He raised the burning stick higher and stepped forward one step, then another, his voice deep and strong, carrying through the mist. Though the cubs did not understand the words, they felt the weight of them. The predators stopped. Their growls faded to uneasy huffs. They lowered their heads, but did not dare step closer. The fire crackled and roared brighter as the human thrust it toward them. The flames leapt high, casting long shadows across the valley. The beast shuddered and pulled back step by step until the mist swallowed them again, and the night was silent once more. The cubs trembled in awe. They had seen their strongest warriors fall before such beasts. They had heard cries of terror when hunters failed to return, but this human, alone with nothing but fire and will, had stood unshaken and turned the danger away. The cubs looked at him with new eyes filled with wonder and trust and something like loyalty. The fire burned steady. The mist wrapped around the valley like a cloak, and the cubs pressed close to the human, no longer thinking of fleeing, no longer thinking of home. They only thought of the fire, the warmth, and the figure who seemed untouchable in the face of the dark. And so the night passed with the human keeping watch, and the cubs curled near the flames, their dreams filled with sparks and voices they did not yet understand, while the valley itself seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for the story to unfold. The night was heavy with silence, broken only by the hiss of fire and the distant call of unseen creatures, and the cubs lay close to one another, therefore glowing in the flicker of the flames, and their eyes wide with awe and fear and wonder. And the human sat still near them, his shadow long and sharp against the mist, his hands steady on the stick wrapped with fire. The circle of light around them small, yet strong against the endless dark. The cubs whispered soft sounds among themselves, tails twitching, ears shifting every time a branch cracked or a stone shifted in the distance. They had always known the dark as a place of fear, where eyes glowed and teeth gleamed, and where no young one dared step without the protection of hunters. Yet now they sat in the middle of that same dark, and the human faced it as though it were nothing. The growls came again, closer, this time deeper, louder, vibrating through the earth. Beneath their paws the cubs pressed together their small bodies, trembling, their hearts beating fast like the wings of frightened birds. They turned their eyes to the human, waiting to see if he too would tremble, if he too would lower his gaze and prepare to flee. Yet he did not. He rose slowly, his movements calm, deliberate, every action measured, as though he had faced such moments countless times before. The fire in his hand burned brighter when he lifted it, the flames dancing and twisting like living spirits. The growls turned into snarls, shapes moved in the mist, shadows larger than any the cubs had ever seen, claws scraping stone, eyes burning with hunger and patience. The circle of the fire seemed small against them, and the cubs whimpered, pressing their bellies to the ground, their instincts crying for them to run, but their legs would not move. The human stepped forward one pace, then another, his voice rising in strange sounds, deep and strong, carrying through the valley with force. The cubs could not understand the words, but the tone wrapped around them heavy like iron. The predators flinched their heads, lowering their pace, faltering as though the voice itself struck at them, and still the human advanced, not with speed, but with certainty, his fire held high, his eyes locked on the glowing eyes before him. The beast circled their bodies, rippling with muscle, their teeth flashing as they tested the edge of the firelight. One leapt forward and landed close, its roar shaking the air. The cubs yelped and ducked into the dirt, but the human did not move back. Instead, he thrust the fire forward, the flames leaping into the beast's face. It reeled away with a cry, stumbling back into the mist and vanishing from sight. The other shapes hesitated, their growls softer, now less certain. The human's voice rose again, steady and unbroken like the roll of thunder across mountains. He struck the ground with the burning stick, sparks flying upward, the fire roaring louder than before. The beasts wavered, their glowing eyes blinking, uncertain tails lashing with frustration. Before one by one they retreated into the dark, their forms swallowed by the mist, until only silence remained. Once more the cubs lifted their heads slowly, their eyes wide, their ears perked in disbelief. They had seen the greatest hunters of their clan avoid such creatures. They had heard the cries of warriors who met them unprepared, yet this lone human had driven them back with nothing but fire and voice. And while the cubs felt their fear twist into something new, something closer to respect, something that burned like the fire in their chests. The human lowered the stick, the flame still alive but smaller now, and he placed it back into the circle of wood, feeding the fire with new branches until it grew tall. Once more, he sat again, breathing calm, as if the moment had been no more than a passing breeze. The cubs crept closer, their eyes fixed on him, their hearts beating with questions. They could not speak. They pressed their small bodies near the warmth, as though to draw strength from his presence. The valley settled again, the mist drifting with slow grace, the fire burning bright against the endless night. The cubs tried to sleep, but their dreams came alive with images of the beasts and the fire, and the human's unshaken stance. They woke, often their ears catching every sound, yet each time their eyes fell on the figure who guarded them, their fear eased, and their bodies settled once more. When morning came, the light was weak but steady. The human rose with the sun, and the cubs followed, watching as he gathered tools and shaped them with hands skilled and precise. He carved wood with sharp stone, he tied hide into cords, he built things with purpose, and each action seemed to hold meaning. The cubs tried to copy him, clumsy with their paws, but eager to learn. He watched them, his eyes soft, as though he knew their attempts were important. He shared food again, cooked over the fire, and the cubs ate hungrily, their bellies filled with warmth and strength. They laughed in soft growls at the strange taste, but they wanted more, and the human gave without anger or demand. The cubs felt bonds forming, though they did not yet understand the shape of them. Far away in the den, the elders felt a shift in the air. Once more the scarred elder raised her head and said, "The cubs have passed the first test." And the others asked what test, but she gave no answer, only stared into the flames and whispered that the valley had chosen, and now the clan must prepare. By the second night, the cubs no longer looked at the shadows with fear. They looked at them with challenge. Their small bodies sat straighter, their eyes brighter, for they had seen the dark pushed back by fire and voice, and they carried that memory in their hearts. The human sat with them once more, his song rising into the night, low and steady. The cubs leaned close, listening, their ears twitching with every sound they could not understand but somehow felt. And so the first test ended, not with the cubs running in terror, not with their cries echoing through the valley, but with silence and calm, and the fire burning strong. The cubs curled near the human, their dreams filled with sparks and courage, while the mist outside swirled, waiting for the next test to come. The dawn came slow and pale over the valley, and the fire burned lower, now only glowing embers resting under a thin curl of smoke. The cubs stirred, their eyes blinking in the soft light, and their bellies still full from the food the human had given them the night before. They stretched their small legs, yawned with sharp little teeth, and looked up at the human, who was already awake, moving with quiet purpose, his hands busy shaping new pieces of wood and stone, as if sleep was a thing he did not need. The cubs whispered to each other, their voices hushed but full of excitement. They knew they could not stay away forever. They knew the den would be waiting, the elders would be watching, the hunters would be searching, and yet their paws felt heavy when they thought of leaving the fire and the strange figure who had shown them courage against the beasts of the dark. Still they rose, because they could not delay forever. The human looked at them with those calm eyes, and though no words were shared, it felt as if he understood that they must go. His head tilted slightly, his hand resting near the embers, as though he was giving them a choice to return or remain. The cubs hesitated, their ears twitching, their tails flicking, but in the end they turned toward the mist and the path that led back to the cliffs of their people. The walk back was long, and the valley seemed different now, the trees less threatening, the stones less sharp, the mist less heavy. It was as if the fire had given them new eyes, new hearts that no longer saw only danger in the world. They padded side by side, tails brushing against each other, their steps firm, their heads high, as though something had shifted inside them. When they reached the den, the air was tense. The clan had gathered near the entrance, their eyes sharp, their bodies restless. The scarred elder sat at the front, her gaze heavy as stone. The cubs entered with ears flat, but steps steady, their hearts pounding, yet their eyes unflinching. The silence that met them was heavy like chains pressing on their backs. One hunter stepped forward, his voice loud and sharp, demanding, "Where have you been? What have you touched? What curse have you carried back with you?" The cubs did not shrink. They spoke together, their voices young but clear. They said, "We were in the valley. We saw the fire. We sat with the one from the stories, and he did not harm us. He gave us food. He kept us safe from the beasts of the night." The den erupted in growls, mothers pulling their little ones back, warriors raising claws, hunters baring teeth, the air filled with anger and fear. But the cubs did not bow their heads. They stood, their fur bristling, their eyes fierce. They repeated again, "He is not the enemy. He is not the curse, he is the fire, and the fire is life." The scarred elder raised her head, and her voice cut through the noise silence, and the den fell quiet, her eyes fixed on the cubs, her tail. Still she asked them, "What did you feel when you sat with him?" The cubs answered with one voice, "We felt safe, we felt strong, we felt as if we could be more than we are." The elder studied them for a long time, her gaze heavy and unreadable. The warriors shifted uneasily, the mothers whispered among themselves, the hunters snarled under their breath. Yet the cubs did not flinch, their eyes burned with the memory of the fire, with the courage they had seen in the human. At last the scarred elder spoke, her voice low but steady. "The valley has touched you, and once touched none return unchanged. You have brought back its mark, and the fire will burn inside you until the end of your days. Whether it brings ruin or strength, we cannot yet know." The cubs lowered their heads, but not in shame. It was respect. They felt the weight of her words, but they did not regret what they had done. They could still feel the warmth of the fire on their fur, the taste of the strange food in their mouths, the sound of the human's song in their hearts, and no words could take that away. The clan was divided. Some whispered that the cubs were cursed and must be cast out before the human followed them back into the cliffs. Others whispered that perhaps the time had come to face the truth of the old stories, that maybe the wanderer was not only death, but also knowledge and strength. The air was thick with fear and argument, and no answer came. The cubs stayed in the den that night, yet they did not feel the same safety they once had. The fire at the center seemed smaller, colder than the fire they had seen in the valley. The voices of their people seemed weaker than the voice that had commanded the beasts of the dark. They lay awake, eyes open, tails restless, ears twitching, and they whispered to each other that they would go back, that they must see the human again. The scarred elder sat apart, her eyes on the flames, her body still, but her mind turning. She had seen change before. She had lived through storms and wars and losses that tore the clan apart, and she knew the fire the cubs spoke of was not only a flame of wood and smoke, but something larger, something that could reshape them all. She whispered to the flames that the world was turning again. The next day the cubs walked among their people, their heads high, their eyes unafraid, their voices firm. When they spoke, no longer did they cower under the weight of the older hunters. No longer did they bow too quickly to the warnings of fear. They carried with them a piece of the valley, and though they were still young, their steps sounded louder, their shadows stretched longer. The clan watched them uneasily, for children should not walk with such pride, children should not speak with such certainty. Yet the cubs had, and the elders could not take it back, and the mothers could not unhear it, and the warriors could not ignore it. And so the whisper spread that the human had returned, that the old stories were alive again, that change was coming whether they welcomed it or not. And in the quiet of night, when the mist rolled once more through the valley, the cubs dreamed of the fire and the human waiting beside it, and they knew their paws would find the path again soon, for their hearts were no longer bound by fear, and their souls no longer tied to silence. The days that followed were restless and heavy with tension. The cubs moved through the den with eyes that no longer looked down at the stone floor, but straight ahead, and the clan could feel the change, like a wound that would not heal. The whispers never stopped. Some said the cubs carried the curse of the valley, others said they carried its blessing, and the air was thick with fear that pressed on every chest like weighty stone. The scarred elder sat by the fire, often her gaze locked on the flames, as though searching for answers that the smoke might carry to her from the ancestors. She said little, and when she did speak, her words were measured, like claws drawn slowly across rock. The hunters grew uneasy, for they could not fight whispers with their claws, and the mothers drew their little ones close, fearing that even the breath of the cubs might carry danger back into the hearts of their children. Far beyond the cliffs and the wide plains, other clans heard the news. Word carried on wings, and on wandering traders who passed between valleys. They told of cubs who sat beside the fire, of a human who returned from the sky, of a figure who commanded beasts and sang to the night with a voice that made even the mist listen. And soon the stories grew larger than truth, as stories often do. Some said he had raised mountains with his hands, some said he had swallowed fire and spat out thunder. Some said the cubs no longer walked as cubs, but as shadows of something greater. The rival clans gathered in their own dens, and their own fires burned with the weight of old warnings. One chieftain spoke in rage that the human would bring ruin upon them all, and that the cubs were traitors who had opened the gate to death. Another spoke with fear, saying, "If the human is real, then perhaps he comes not as enemy, but as ruler." and we must bend before him. Others whispered that war might come, for if one clan carried the fire, then all must either share in it or destroy it before it consumed them. Back in the valley the cubs returned, often their paws sure upon the mist path, their ears alert, their hearts full of both dread and excitement. The human welcomed them each time with the same calm, the same fire, the same strange food that filled them with strength. He showed them more of his tools. He carved wood into shapes they had never seen. He struck metal against stone and made edges sharper than claws. He tied cords of hide in ways that could hold weight, and he did it all with patience, as though teaching young ones not just to see but to learn. The cubs imitated him with clumsy paws, their laughter soft and bright in the firelight. They carried back pieces of wood charred and broken. They carried back stories of beasts driven away with nothing but flame. And while the clan listened in silence, each time their eyes burning with both fear and wonder, the hunters growled, the mothers cried, the elders whispered, and still the cubs spoke with courage. One night the scarred elder rose, her tail stiff, her voice low, yet carrying through the den. She said, the storm is coming. The human has returned, not as ghost, not as legend, but as flesh and fire. And now the clans will gather. Some will seek to destroy him, others will seek to claim him, and we must decide whether we stand against him or beside him. The den erupted in cries. Some shouted that they must strike now, that they must march into the valley with all their strength and end him before the storm grew larger. Others shouted that such a thing was impossible, that to strike at the fire was to strike at the heart of the world, and it would consume them. Instead, the cubs stood in the center, their voices sharp for one so young, and they said, we will protect him even against you if we must. And their words echoed like thunder against the stone walls. The clan was stunned. Never had cubs spoken with such defiance. Never had young hearts burned so openly with loyalty to something beyond their own blood. The hunters bared teeth, ready to silence them, but the scarred elder raised her paw, and the den froze. Her eyes heavy, her voice like stone. She said, if you raise claw against them, then you raise claw against the valley itself, and none who do so will survive. The clan fell silent, yet the storm in their hearts did not fade. It grew heavier with each passing day, as news spread of clans moving closer, of fires burning on far ridges, of warriors sharpening weapons, and voices chanting songs of war. The cubs felt the pressure, but they did not falter. Their paws still carried them back to the valley, to the fire, to the human, who sat with calm eyes, as though he had already seen the storm long before they were born. The human began to build larger things with his tools. He shaped stones into walls, he tied hides into coverings, he sharpened sticks into spears. The cubs watched wide-eyed as a camp rose around the fire, not just a circle of warmth, but a place of standing, a place of strength. They helped in their small ways, carrying sticks, pulling cords, their laughter echoing across the mist, though they did not know if they were preparing for safety or for battle. When night fell and the mist thickened, the cubs curled near the human, once more their dreams restless, filled with images of warriors, with torches marching through the dark, of fires clashing with fire, of voices shouting in rage. They woke, often their ears twitching, their hearts pounding, and each time the human was awake, watching the flames, his face calm as though waiting. The scarred elder dreamed as well, her sleep troubled with visions of storms breaking over the valley, of shadows clashing in the firelight, of cubs standing before armies with eyes that did not bend. She woke each morning with heavier weight in her bones. She told the others, the valley is watching us, and soon it will decide. The clans began to move closer, their scouts seen in the hills, their fires burning brighter on the horizon. The storm was no longer distant. It was gathering at the edges of the valley, pressing nearer. Each night the cubs felt it in their bones, like thunder before rain. The human seemed to feel it too, though his face did not change. His hands moved faster, shaping tools, feeding fire, building strength. The cubs did not run from it. They sat with him each night, their eyes steady, their hearts filled with both fear and pride. They knew the storm would break soon, and when it did, they would not hide in the den. They would not cower behind elders or hunters. They would stand beside the human, for they had already chosen, and their choice could not be undone. And so the valley held its breath. The fire burned, the mist swirled, the clans gathered, the cubs grew bolder, and the human waited calm, steady, certain, as though the storm was nothing but another story already written in the smoke of the fire. The valley lay silent beneath the weight of waiting. The mist was heavy like a curtain that refused to lift, and the fire at the center burned tall, casting long shadows across the earth. The cubs sat close, their eyes fixed on the flames, their bodies tense, their ears twitching at every sound beyond the light, for they knew the storm had reached its edge, and soon it would fall. The human sat among them, calm as ever, his hand steady as he placed more wood into the fire, sparks rising into the night like stars set free. He did not speak, but his silence was its own message, his gaze deep as stone, his breath even and unbroken. The cubs felt his certainty in their bones, and though their young hearts pounded with fear, they also burned with pride. From the hills came the first sign, the glow of many torches flickering through the mist, voices carried across the distance, harsh and heavy, the voices of warriors singing the songs of battle. The sound rolled like thunder over the valley, and the cubs pressed close, their tails curling tight. Yet they did not run, their paws stayed planted in the dirt, their eyes locked on the human. Soon shapes appeared through the mist, lines of warriors from rival clans, their bodies painted with ash, their weapons raised high, their eyes burning with the fire of fear and rage. They marched together until they surrounded the camp, their torches casting walls of light against the night. The air grew thick with growls and whispers, and the fire in the center cracked louder as though answering. The cubs stood before the human, their bodies small yet unyielding. They spread themselves across the line of fire, their eyes fierce, their voices sharp. They shouted, "He is not your enemy. He is not your curse. He is fire, and fire is life." Their words rang through the valley, though their voices were young. The warriors faltered for a moment. Hearing cubs speak with such defiance was unnatural, it made them uneasy. But the chiefs of the rival clans raised their weapons high, their voices booming above the crowd. They shouted, "He is danger, he is death, he is the shadow of ruin sent to break our people, and if we do not end him now, then none of us will survive." Their followers roared in answer, and the valley shook with the sound. The scarred elder stepped forward from among her own people, her head held high, her eyes steady, though her body bore the weight of many years. She spoke with a voice that cut through the chaos. She said, "You call him curse, you call him ruin. Yet have you not feared the dark since the first day you opened your eyes? Have you not lost hunters and warriors to beasts that hide in the night? This human alone stood against them with only fire and voice. And will he is danger? Yes, but danger can be shield and danger can be teacher, and to strike him down now is to strike away the choice that the valley itself has given us." The warriors growled among themselves, some nodded with doubt, others snarled with anger. The chiefs shouted again, calling her words weakness, calling her clan cursed. But before they could move, the cubs cried out together, their voices ringing like steel, "We will not let you harm him. If you raise claw against him, then you must strike us first." And their small bodies stood taller than ever, their eyes bright like the fire itself. The rival clans hesitated. The sight of cubs unshaken stirred something deep inside them, for courage was not expected from such young hearts. Courage of that kind belonged to warriors, yet here it was burning brighter than all their torches. The chiefs wavered, their tails lashing, their voices faltering, but the storm was not yet broken. The human rose then slowly, his figure tall, his shadow long against the mist. He stepped forward past the cubs, his eyes calm, his fire held high. He did not raise his weapon. He did not shout. His voice was steady, low, yet carrying to all who stood in the valley. He said words they did not understand, but the weight of them pressed into their hearts like mountains. The fire leapt as he spoke. The mist curled back, the earth seemed to listen. He lowered his fire then and placed it into the ground before him, his hands open, empty. He looked at the warriors with no anger, with no fear, only with a kind of offering. The meaning was clear even without words. He was not here to conquer. He was not here to enslave. He was here to share, to teach, to give. The silence that followed was deep. The rival clans shifted their weapons, lowering them slightly, their eyes uncertain. The chiefs growled, but their followers did not answer, for doubt had entered their hearts. They looked at the cubs, their small bodies unyielding. They looked at the scarred elder, her eyes steady as stone. They looked at the human, who stood calm and unarmed beside his fire, and the storm inside them cracked. One voice rose from the crowd, a young warrior, who shouted, "If he is ruin, then why do cubs defend him with their lives? If he is curse, then why does fire give warmth and safety, where before there was only fear?" And the words cut deep, spreading through the crowd like sparks in dry grass. More voices rose, some in agreement, some in anger, until the unity of the storm was broken. The chiefs roared in fury, but their commands fell heavy and unheeded, for their followers no longer marched as one. Some lowered weapons fully Some turned their eyes away, some even stepped back into the mist, unwilling to strike against the cubs, unwilling to strike against the fire. The valley held its breath. Once more the choice lay heavy before them: to fight, or to turn away to destroy, or to accept, to cling to fear, or to step into something new. The scarred elder raised her head and spoke. The valley has chosen, and the choice is this: we can no longer live as we once did. We can no longer hide from fire. We can no longer silence the truth. The human is here. He is flesh, and he is flame, and we must decide whether we stand with him or against him. But if we stand against him, then we stand against our own young, and against the valley itself. The rival clans lowered their eyes. The chiefs growled, but their strength faded. The storm broke, not with battle, not with blood, but with silence, and the fire still burned bright in the center. The cubs stood tall, their bodies trembling, yet their eyes fierce. They had not run, and they had not bowed, and because of them the valley was changed. The human bent slowly and lifted the fire, once more holding it steady, his eyes calm, his face unreadable. He turned and looked to the cubs, and for a moment the valley seemed to fade away, leaving only them, the fire, the mist, and the choice they had made together. And so the story of that night did not end with the clash of blades or the fall of warriors. It ended with cubs standing unbroken, with elders speaking truth, with clans hesitating before fear, and with a human who offered fire instead of death. The storm had come, and the storm had passed, yet its echo would remain forever, for nothing in the valley would ever be the same again.